fixed. Hey, there we go. See, we just working through things, working through complicated. We gotta figure it out. Oh yeah, the wind. We gotta see how the wind. Let's see how the wind sounds.
How the wind sounds? Like real bad. People want it the comments.
Oh, you should say leave a wind emoji.
Oh damn. Oh damn. Oh yeah.
Oh shit! What is that? What is it?
Is it a poster board?
I don't know what it is.
Oh, you just stepped on it.
Okay. How does the wind? All right. So the wind sound all right with the wind?
How's the sound? Is
any wind getting through?
No, it's not supposed to.
Supposed to bag if the wind is blowing real hard.
Okay. I think we're gonna go with this sounding good for right now. So unless somebody interjects and says something different.
Speak up.
Okay. So you're the.
All right.
Yep.
All right. We're gonna start our group discussion of day 2 of the ongoing teaching.
Yep. The end of policing. Yep.
The end of we finish up already today. The end of policing by Alex. You say Vitale or
Yeah,
Vitale?
I say Vitale.
You say Vitale.
Yeah, I think that's how it is.
Is it a Dick Vitale or is it Dick Vitale?
Oh, that's a good question. I like this.
This is my second time reading it. I read it about the same time we came out here. The same time we came out here, the first time I read it. And what really stuck out to me the first time I read it is just the finances of things. It's not an issue of we don't have the money. It's an issue of the money being misspent. It's the issue of the cycle, people cycling in and out of jail. It's inefficient. It's a lot more costly than it would be to offer somebody housing or to provide adequate care. And this time around, just based on things that we have gone through since then, what really stuck out to me is one of the chapters I read was criminalizing homelessness. And just based on the things that we have seen out here and interactions we have had with different unhoused folks, where especially when it got cold, it almost seemed like they didn't have no other choice but to go to jail. It almost seemed like they wanted to get arrested just so they can have a just so they can have a bed to sleep in, not even a decent place. And that's not the way it should be at all. That's not the way that it should be at all. Being in jail is a traumatizing thing. Being in jail is not a solution. Being in jail is not gonna. That person's gonna be back out in the streets when it gets warmer. It's gonna be the same type of situation. Have to keep going through that cycle. What do you think? How many times have you read this book, and what things stood out to you at the first time?
We're gonna address the mic thing. The first time I read the book was the very beginning of the demonstrations and the protests that were taking place last year. Talk louder. Let me see. Oh, it's talking to you. The first time that I've read this all together now 2 times with the reading that we're doing here. I think that the thing that stood out to me the most, I only read 1 chapter, so it was different than the last book we read, where I read a few chapters and had a few different things that stood out. I think the thing that stood out to me the most, I read the War on Drugs chapter, and it reminded me very much of a summarization of the last chapter in the New Jim Crow, where Michelle Alexander sort of walks through Nixon being elected, and then American politics on the national stage and on the local stage, and how things have digressed and evolved in certain communities since Nixon. It was a quote in here that I want to, let me see something real quick. A quote in here that I want to get back to. And we should have started it, not we should have, but we're going to try to starting it off with giving a summarization of the book. Somebody suggested that. I think that collectively think that's a good idea. But I want to read this portion, because the first time I read this book, I don't think that this portion stuck with me as heavily as it did this time. But I have also read this same quote in different books. Where is it at? Let's see. Okay, let's see. This is a quote from Richard Nixon's chief domestic policy advisor. This was after his presidential run. He was on a talk show speaking. He said, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." I think that, going back and reading the war on drugs portion, I read that twice. That stuck with me a little bit differently than the last times that I've read it. I know that before me and you had spoken, I spoke about reading the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. and he speaks about Richard Nixon, and he says that he had a meeting with Richard Nixon after Richard Nixon was the vice president when he was getting ready to run against John F. Kennedy, and he felt that Richard Nixon understood the civil rights issue better than Kennedy did. And he felt like Richard Nixon understood the civil rights issue better than he did when he was the sitting vice president. He felt that he had made a concerted effort to become more informed and that he was well-meaning and had good intentions on these issues. But he gave a caveat at the end of, this was in the 50s, 59 I think, caveat at the end of stating that and said that if Richard Nixon was ingenuine about any of the things that he said to him, then Richard Nixon was the most dangerous man in America. And to hear him say that, to see him have written and said that in 1959, and then to see that the first president to be elected after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed was Richard Nixon. The first president to really be elected after the small successes of the civil rights movement was Richard Nixon. And you can see that the turn in American politics, the turn in American values, all of those things sort of shifted around the time when Richard Nixon became president. And from Richard Nixon all the way until, honestly, till you get to Bill Clinton, you can see the expansion of the prison network in America and the expansion of the policing network in America. And so reading that again just sort of gave me a review and just sort of reminded me of how dangerous presidential politics can be. Wrong part.
Got some comments in here.
Okay.
Got some comments. Criminalizing homelessness or mental illness or drug addiction doesn't solve the root problems. That's correct. He goes on to say, highly trained police officers don't need to be handling traffic accidents. We spend too much money on police to do these relatively simple and safe things.
What about you? What did you pull away from your
reading
chapter?
it, I know you only read the chapter at the end.
And that had connected with you very. That should have connected with you pretty deeply. Now, I read that. I was reading that chapter when we got arrested the first time. Like I was like on the first two pages of the chapter. We got arrested down there on July 31st. So I felt as if when it happened, I felt like I had got pulled out of the pages of everything happening. So what did you think about the policing politics, or is that what it's called?
Yeah, so I had read the last chapter and then I read the conclusion, and I made it a point to basically step out and kind of dissect that while I was reading and relate it back to what happens in the Rockford community, which I know we all have our different reading styles and things like that, but that's kind of one of the things that I do to basically ground myself and whoever else would be reading. In case you didn't know, this is a very real thing that happens locally. It's not just things that happen in major cities or things that happen in Chicago. This isn't like a far from home idea. This is happening right here in our city. So I thought the same thing. I thought that it was the Miami tactic or whatever, something based out of Miami. and it was essentially all of the same things. How they're saying that they're using less lethal strategies, or less lethal weaponry is what they said. So all of the same things that they were using here with the pepper bullets and stuff, which you know about, the pepper spray, which I know about, the tear gas, which anybody who was there towards the last hour or so, or a couple hours of May 30th would know about them basically gassing an entire city block, residents included. It wasn't just people who were out on the front lawn. It was, it wasn't a real windy day, but the wind carried it enough to where people who were inside their homes, or people who were standing on their porches, were bothered by it, and they weren't even necessarily a part of what was going on. So, them using those tactics, and then them using predetermined arrests. It spoke about where they had certain people that were pinpointed as what they thought were leaders, or dictated in some kind of way, led in some kind of way, how the protest was going to go, where it was going to go, what was going to happen. And so those people were almost immediately targeted, and it was almost a weekly thing where those people, not just you, but other people at this table, other people, in the movement, were repeatedly targeted and repeatedly arrested under the assumption that they had cultivated or led in some way this protest to carry on the way that it carried on, when in reality, and it even spoke about in the book, that most of these organizations, most of these protests, most of these direct actions are peaceful. A lot of these groups are based in the idea of nonviolence. That's one of the things that we try to stress, is that we're a nonviolent group, and that we don't have any intentions to be violence. Most times, nobody is even goes into any kind of defense mode. They talk about your instincts are fight, flight, or freeze, and I've rarely seen anybody who fights back when it comes to dealing with the police. So we're based in being nonviolent, and the only violence that occurs is at the hands of the police. So much like they describe all of these organizations, dating back decades from when they first created the FBI and these intelligence units, these co-intel units, to gather all this information and define these people as terrorists and terrorist organizations. There's no basis for that. All of these groups are rooted in vehemently being nonviolent, and the only violence that started is basically at the hands of the police, when they've decided they're willing to suppress us and put order above our right to free speech and our right to assemble. So that's I took a second and related that back to Rockford and directly City Market and some of the protests that we've had here, where we've experienced a lot of the same things, a lot of the same tactics. They've called us Antifa, and they think that Antifa was described as a terrorist organization, so they essentially all call us domestic terrorists. And so they've used the same tactics, trying to turn the community against us, thinking that we're violent, when protests went on for weeks. Protests, whether it was directly after May 30th, when we were marching down State or marching down Perryville, whether it was the first few weeks of City Market, all of these protests, while we were doing them and there was no police intervention, there was no violence. There were, occasions where somebody tried to run their car through, or, somebody decided to take it upon themselves to instigate violence, but there was no mass accounts of violence until there was police interference during City Market. So definitely that last chapter and in the conclusion, when it spoke about those types of things, I definitely felt like, yeah, I could relate to that too, because it was describing all of the same tactics that they would use here, and the same things that they would use here to suppress a movement.
Quick announcements real quick. Saturday and Sunday, every weekend of this month, we're going to have breakfast down here in the park. It's free to anybody that wants to come down. We're going to have breakfast starting at 9 a.m. I believe. At 9 a.m. we're going to be having breakfast. And along with Saturday, tomorrow, at 2 p.m., we're going to be going around putting putting the pictures back up of the memorials, along with adding a couple flowers and things like that to each of them. So 2 p.m. tomorrow, come down, add to the memorials, learn a little bit about each individual, and every breakfast every weekend this month. One thing that stood out to me in this book is that if I was to compare it to the New Jim Crow, it was a lot more personal stories rather than statistics. It was a lot more a lot more situations, and talks about individual cases and things that happen to persons and things that happen to individuals. And it really, at times, it was hard to read. It really was. It really struck home to me, and it was really difficult to read. And especially reading the passage about unhoused people. It reminded me of the story of Donald Cooper, who was shot by the police in Rockford in 2006. This is a short little news clip, news article from the Rockford Register about Donald Cooper. It was published in 2006. On February 5th, police shot and killed Donald Cooper. Bystanders said he was aggressively panhandling outside Highlander grocery store on North Main and Riverside Boulevard. Police say Cooper was following customers into the store, harassing them for money. When police confronted him, authorities say he became agitated and reached into his waistband. Cooper was unarmed. The shooting was ruled justified.
Hey, how you doing?
This is just a short little news story about Donald Cooper, but other stories would go on and give more in depth about how when the police showed up, he ran. He ran from those police. He hadn't really committed no crimes, really. He saw the police, he got scared, he ran like anybody else did. And a lot of these stories, they say, oh, he reached in his waistband. Oh, he was reaching for his waist. It looked like he had a gun. It looked like he was doing this. And almost all of them, even with Denzel, in the police report that McNeese wrote, it said that Denzel had reached into his waistband at some point. Denzel was unarmed, just like Donald Cooper. So you've been paying a lot more attention to, I know it's good to relate things back to Rockford, but it'd be kind of bad to just ignore what's happening nationally. You've been paying a lot of attention to the George Floyd trial. Listening to that, right?
The Derek Chauvin trial.
The Derek Chauvin trial. I'm sorry.
The Derek Chauvin trial.
The Derek Chauvin trial. What are your thoughts on that as it wrapped up its first week?
So since we've been, I caught the first few days, since we've been doing the teach-in, I've kind of redirected some of my attention. I got to catch a little bit of it today. There was I believe a sergeant that they had interviewed. But overall, I think that there is a solid case. So I want to be hopeful that this would be an instance of justice, and that moving forward from this situation, that we can use this to further hold police accountable for their wrongdoings, whether on the clock or off duty. But just because of history, I also I feel like there's the chance that he's just going to get off, and that nothing is going to happen to Derek Chauvin, regardless that he that there was an EMT on scene saying that he was showing signs of, not being able to breathe, that he had urinated on himself, that he passed out, regardless of the multiple people saying to check his pulse, regardless of the officer being fired almost immediately after the situation, obviously showing that he had done something wrong, because clearly, it takes a lot for an officer to lose their position. Most times they get put on administrative leave, and they quote unquote investigate the situation. They come back and they say, well, the police officer was doing everything that they were trained to do, and so we made the decision that they haven't done anything wrong, and we're just going to reinstate them, and they're going to carry on like they didn't just murder somebody a month ago. That's not what happened in this case. He was actually let go, terminated from the job almost immediately following the death of George Floyd, or following the murder of George Floyd. And it makes me think that there's progress, but I'm not sure that we've come that far. We've come far enough maybe for them to face accountability in the form of losing a job, losing payment, losing benefits, but I don't think that we have come that far in actually holding them legally accountable to where he's going to have to face any kind of prison time. If he is convicted, I don't have high hopes that his sentence will be run similar to anybody else that's been convicted of that crime, especially if it's been a person of color. I don't have faith that he's going to face the same kind of justice or be held to the same level of accountability that somebody who is a person of color or somebody who doesn't hold that position would have to face if they committed a similar crime or something like that. So I think that him being fired, I think that that's great and everything, but if justice looks like somebody being convicted and sentenced to a specific sentence and being convicted of a specific crime when they commit this offense, then I think that needs to look the same across the board. Regardless of how I feel about police or prison abolition, this is where we're at right now, and so if this is where we're at, then justice needs to look the same for everybody. Justice needs to look the same for George Floyd as it would for an officer who was shot while they were pursuing a suspect, or something of that nature. I think it needs to look the same across the board, and if we're not holding everybody to the same standard, then the system obviously is not going to work, and it needs to be replaced with one that is fair and impartial to all.
We got a question. I think this would be best equipped for you.
Oh yeah, I see my question.
I forgot the conclusion of the book. Did the author suggest an alternative to policing as far as how we enforce laws, investigate crime, and provide public safety in society?
Yeah, so I kind of spoke about it when I finished out the book, or before I ended the video, but I can definitely reiterate for anybody who hasn't seen that or wasn't available when it was live. They did, and basically they spoke about how we need a livable wage, how we need affordable housing, and how we need youth programs and community-based programs that don't involve police interference or things like that. And they also made a point to say that we cannot continue to ask for help from the police. Basically, we cannot continue to call them for petty issues like today. The police got called because there was a man out here that was neurologically diverse, and he was experiencing a mental health crisis, and he ended up having the police called on him. The police came, and he was immediately fearful. It was very obvious that he had probably had some encounter with them at some point, and so he was immediately fearful. I didn't do anything wrong. Please don't arrest me. He at some point was saying that the police had come to his house and killed his hamster. So there were moments of like in and out. But he was very adamant about he didn't want help from the police because he didn't trust them, that he was afraid of them, that they were going to hurt him, and they ended up calling, ambulance, paramedic, whatever. He didn't want to go with them. He was very specific about what he wanted. He wanted somebody to be called, a specific person to be called, and they didn't want to call that person. They also didn't want to try to have that person come out. He didn't want to go with them. He was very fearful. He just wanted to be left alone at that point because they weren't willing to help him in the way that he wanted to be helped, and he also wasn't willing to accept the help that they were trying to offer, which was different from what he was wanting. So they ended up leaving. He kind of hung out for a while. And essentially what happened with the situation was a third party, Miss Carley's, ended up being contacted, and we were able to get him some kind of help that he needed. But initially, when the police showed up, he was fearful, and they clearly were not equipped to handle that situation. However, the fact that the police were called makes it seem like they did something and that we do need them to help in situations like that. So if you continue to call the police in situations like that, where they either do nothing or end up arresting the person, saying that they're unwell, or they end up basically tying them down to a gurney and transporting them to the hospital, and admitting them to the psych ward against their will. He wasn't a person that was harm. He wasn't a harm to himself or anybody around him. So it wasn't a necessity that they bring out somebody to provide protection. There was nobody's safety besides the fact that he was real cold and he just needed to get to a place. He kept saying he wanted to get to a place to warm up. He was real cold. Besides that, he wasn't a threat to anybody's safety. He wasn't. There wasn't anybody around that needed protection from him, or he didn't need protection from anybody else except from the police. But when we continue to call the police in situations like that, or we continue to have police interference in petty situations or situations that can be resolved without the interference of police, then it makes it seem like we have a need for them. And instead of providing those things that the community actually needs, like affordable housing, living wages, and things like that, we're going to keep getting police. So as long as we, continue to call them out, as long as we continue to ask for help from them, they're going to say, you don't need those other things when you have the police. So instead of getting us all to a point where we don't have people that are experiencing houselessness or trespassing on property to find a warm place or a secluded place to sleep, or having mental health crises, as long if we can get people, if we can get some mental health care, if we can get some youth programs, if we can get some affordable housing programs, if we can get some livable wages, then we wouldn't be seeing so many of these people in situations where people are feeling the need now to reach out to the police for help, because at the end of the day, all they're doing is criminalizing, victimizing, and brutalizing these people, and we don't have a need for that, because then it just creates this endless cycle. He becomes fearful of the police, doesn't want police interference, sends them away, doesn't get the help that he needs, and then he's still on the streets, either asking for help from other people. He genuinely wanted help, but he just didn't want help from the police because he's afraid of them. So as long as we have that situation and that lifestyle going on, he'll continue to wander around in search of help, and at some point he's gonna rub somebody the wrong way. He kept getting, I don't want to say aggressive, but he kept getting real frustrated, and he kept, he would raise his voice a little, but then he would immediately calm down, and he would say, "I'm sorry, I don't want to be mean, I'm just tired," or "I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, I'm just cold," or situations like that. So it wasn't a situation where he was being violent or he was aggressive in any way. He just wanted help, and it seemed like he was really at his wit's end to try to get some help, and it didn't really seem like nobody was trying to offer him any kind of valid help. They were just trying to send police. So if we continue to send police in situations where people are just needing help, where people are just needing a little pickup, or people are needing to be able to make it in this world, then we're just going to see an endless cycle of mass incarceration and police brutality and victimization of community members. So she does, or he does? They do talk about that in the book, about alternatives to policing, and the fact that if we don't refuse services from the police, then we're going to keep getting services from the police instead of the alternative methods that we actually need to provide better for the community.
Another thing, I had forgotten I had read this about the failures of policing sex work. I thought it was, I don't know, maybe it's because I went to a Catholic school so much, I never really put too much thought about it. And just the different type of challenges that these individuals face when they are engaging in sex work, where people either want to convert them into their religious groups, or they want to, he talks about these liberal feminists who are abolitionists of sex work, and how they, you don't remember that?
I don't remember that, but as I was going back and reading the last portion that I read of that chapter, it jogged my memory about the thing. But one of the things I said as I was reading it is that this was one of the chapters where my vantage point changed. I had thought about something. I had thought about some of those notions before, mainly from like TV shows, watching the TV show, and so that had given me thoughts like that before. But when I read this book, that was the first time in which I really gave my time mentally to delving into all the intricacies of sex work. I said when I read the last portion, I said reading this book is what stopped me from using the word prostitution when speaking about sex work. I think also I had never really thought about I'd always I guess in sort of a joke. I don't know if this is the right platform for this, but sort of in a joking manner, I'd always said, if I got old, I go to Vegas and just party, and sex work is legal there, and it's and so that was always like a sort of a joke that I had, because I understood that sex work was legal in one state, but it wasn't in 49 states. But I never took the time to really dissect what it means for one state in a country that's called the United States to have vastly different laws than other states. It's one of the things that has perplexed me about the marijuana decriminalization and legalization that happens in different places, where perfectly here in Illinois, in Rockford, you can have a certain amount of, supposed to be able to have a certain amount of weed, but you go straight up the up the street up to Wisconsin, and you are in a totally different situation. And so thinking about the fact that, again, it's no way you're not going to ever stop people from doing drugs. You're not going to ever stop people from engaging in sex work. I remember I watched a movie a long time ago, and they said, I think it was the Players Club. I don't know if we've seen the Players Club before. You seen the Players Club? Oh, we went through this.
Don't.
Anyway, hell no. I did not do that. Anyways, in the movie, they say that that's the oldest profession in the world. He was saying the oldest profession in the world is sex work, and so reading those last three pages of that chapter again just sort of reiterated and reminded me of the fact that people have been a lot of the issues a lot of the things that's in this book. People are more concerned with not having to deal with the issue as opposed to trying to fix, the issue, or not having to deal with the causes as opposed to trying to fix what the root of the issue is. People don't want to have to deal with thinking about, sex workers on corners or in open markets and them having to drive by, but they don't care about trying to fix the fact that this feels like all the options. So many pieces. And so that was one of the things that stuck with me with the last sort of three pages of that chapter. But you read the majority of the chapter. So what all things that did you get from that?
One of the main things is just how vulnerable some of these people are, and because it's decriminalized, it's not a situation where they can go to HR, they can go to the police, they can't go to nobody and say they stole our wages or we were abused. I just wanted to read this quick little paragraph.
Yeah, read it, yeah. Mine stays back. Get that mind back right.
You don't know.
Talking about this Ramboy case. The Ramboy case is especially important because of the vulnerabilities faced by lesbian, gay, and transgender and other gender non-conforming or unconventional sex workers. These sex workers are often at risk from clients, police, and predators, and are more likely to operate at the margins of the sex trade. Transgender sex workers are routinely harassed by the police and face violent hate crimes. Too often, police assume that anyone openly transgender or gender nonconforming must be engaged in sex work. In New York City, police routinely target transgender people for harassment and arrest based strictly on their appearance. They are also much more likely to be victims of violence. While sex workers in general are targeted for crimes, these workers also suffer abuse from homophobes and others who object to their gender identity. That really kind of just stuck out to me. I guess you could say that it's not these people don't have a safe workplace in a situation where, again, like they can't go to like HR or nothing. They can't report this to anybody because what they are doing has been so has been so criminalized and so stigmatized. Yeah, that's what we're doing. It's been so criminalized and stigmatized that people almost look at it as like a gross thing.
Yeah.
It's a really unfortunate situation where. But I also want to ask you this. This book was published in 2017.
Yeah.
2017. We've talked a little bit about this before. Is that a lot of these books that got written after the New Jim Crow kind of reference back to it, or have any type of, or draw some things from that. What stood out to you from that regards? Just compare and contrast the two books.
I think for me, comparing, and as you were talking, I was sort of remembering some of this. One of the things for this book specifically, to me, the new Jim Crow is a culmination of the issue as a whole. In the new Jim Crow, they speak specifically about the effects of mass incarceration, but people can't get incarcerated until people can't become incarcerated until they've dealt with the police. You have to be arrested to get into the system of mass incarceration. And so, so in my opinion, the new Jim Crow sort of covers everything. It's like a jack of all trades sort of a book. And as opposed to, in my opinion, the end of policing is more of a master or a king of spades or something like that. It's one, even though it's talking about different iterations of policing, it's focused on policing. As you go through and I think that was the first time reading this book where I really thought about the different sections and segments of policing and instead of just thinking about them as an arbitrary group or a generalized group. And also, I think that in reading into policing, I think in each set of chapters, in each chapter, he goes through people who have died. I think that that's sort of one of the things that separates this from the New Jim Crow too. In each chapter of the New Jim Crow, it's people's lives who have been destroyed, but it isn't really somebody who has died because of the direct things being approached in the chapter. Whereas in the immigration chapter, they speak about people who died because of poor circumstances in immigration centers. In the war on drugs, they speak about people who have been killed because of SWAT teams doing no-knocks and executed them the wrong way. During speaking about sex work, they talk about sex workers who have died because they feel as if they aren't protected in the workplace, because they aren't protected in the workplace, and they talked about, sex workers who have dealt with violence at the hands of the police departments. In the political policing, they talk about people who have died because of persecution due to political policing. So for me, that was one of the things that stood out heavily about the end of policing is the death that's accompanied with each sets of these.